All right, so we're going to get started. I'm going to go in a slightly different direction than Mr. Darling. I'm going to start by talking about the humanities curriculum as a whole. I'm going to give a little kind of mini lesson, a tool that I teach the students, and then hopefully, if I'm also not too long-winded, there's little time for questions. So the high school humanities curriculum has a very strong emphasis on research. Obviously, we write poetry, we do creative writing, we read very widely, and we write very widely. But writing research is very important to me, and to living in general. So this year, students have written 2 long research papers. They've written a 4 to 5 page paper in art history on different art topics. There was art therapy, there was the CIA and modern art, there was the development of the golden age of comics, all sorts of different topics around their interests. And there was also a 5 page paper that students wrote in ancient history, and those were also on topics that were interesting to them. There was homosexuality in ancient Greece, and a comparison of 2 translations of Sappho, all of these kind of little things to dig into. So high school is a big time for research because it's when students transition from using sources that are kind of written for certain age groups, written for children, to having to navigate the adult world of sources, having to go online and just search things and figure out what's real, what's not. And it's a really important moment because they need to develop those skills for college, but they also need to develop those skills for just living in the world, knowing what a news article is and whether or not it's going to be accurate. And as students move through the grades and kind of spiral up, the expectation of using scholarly sources, so things like journal articles and books that are published by academic presses, that expectation gets higher and higher. So right, 9th and 10th, we're kind of starting to talk about it, and then by 12th, we're hoping students can use a scholarly database and understand how to use it, if that's what they're going to use in college. So the way that this writing curriculum kind of goes is the goal, the end point, is that in the fall of their 12th grade year, students will write a 10-page research paper on a topic of their choice, kind of within the modern history realm. And they're meant to do it with a pretty minimal amount of teacher help, right? And they're meant to do it over one main lesson block, a 4-week block. So this is something that I did when I was a Waldorf High School student. I thought it was totally normal and that everyone wrote a 10-page research paper in high school, and then I went to college, and it turns out that that's not normal. Not everyone learns that skill. And I remember my freshman writing workshop, all of my kind of fellow classmates were really struggling with these higher order kind of questions of like, how do I sustain an investigation over 10 pages without kind of like falling off the path? And it's something we had really practiced, so it's something that's really, really valuable. But to get there, we have to scaffold. We have to teach all of these little skills and write shorter papers. So again, this year, we have these 5-page papers. Next year, the 11th grade is going to be working on a 7-page paper. Don't tell them that, I haven't told them yet. But probably around medieval history, we'll do a 7-page paper so that we can work our way up to that 10-pager. So the scaffolding, we learn things like paragraph structure. We talk about, how to write a good question. Another thing that happens in high school is students stop kind of writing like, there's a paper about birds, and they move over to like, this is a paper that answers a question about birds, right? Like moving into that question-driven inquiry. Because again, that's the kind of inquiry that they're going to be doing in college, and that's also the kind of inquiry that we do in our everyday lives. We have to ask questions about our environment, about our workplace, and they have to be good questions. There's such thing as a bad question. I know everyone's told you that there's no bad questions, but there are. And so something we learn is like how to write a question. And I will say that in grad school, there's like the whole first half of it is like how to ask a question, because you have to ask a good question. That matters so much. So most often, students are going to generate their own research question, and then we kind of develop it, workshop it in class, and then develop it into a longer paper. And one other thing I want to mention before I go through this tool is about citation. The kind of classic is that high school uses MLA, and then in college you use whatever your discipline is. That doesn't work. Because high schoolers, they trust us as teachers, and they're like, oh, I have to learn this, I have to learn these rules, these MLA rules. and they get to college and they don't have that flexibility. So something we do here is students learn a variety of different citation styles for research. And it feels overwhelming at first, but really what we're trying to develop is that flexibility, that ability to say, oh, this teacher asked for Chicago, that teacher asked for APA, this teacher asked for some sciencey citation style that I don't know about. And they learn how to go about, kind of accomplishing that goal rather than feeling like they're bound by these restrictions. So what I'm going to go through right now is an acronym called PARCA. You can rearrange these words to say crap, which is the original way that I taught it. This year I taught it as PARCA instead. It was chilly and I moved to Vermont. So this is a tool for assessing the quality of a source. So it's a kind of a set of questions that we ask. So the first one is purpose. So this question is, why does this resource exist? I Google something, I have a question about a bird, whatever, and I come across a resource. Why does this resource exist? Why is this an important question? Why does a resource exist? Why? I'm asking you all. Why is this an important question?
I know.
Yeah.
Maybe he's trying to sell you something.
Maybe trying to sell you something.
Well, yeah, you go, Lee. Go ahead.
That's it. That was my
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe they're trying to sell you something. Maybe they're trying to convince you of something. This is the thing. We're not necessarily saying, oh, we want you to find some sort of non-biased article. Sometimes you want to find an article with bias. Maybe you're writing a critique. But still, you really have to know, why does it exist? We say, go to the About page, look up the author, look at the bottom, look at the top, look all around the article to discover what is the purpose of this article. What is it for? What's the intended audience? Is this for teenagers? Is it for little kids? Is it for scholars? Who's it for? The second one is authority. Not my favorite word. Authority. So who wrote this and what gives them kind of the right to write this? And so again, you can think of this as a set of rules, but you can also think of it as a set of questions. Because we could say, only read things that are on museum websites, or only read things by people who have a PhD, or only read things blah, blah, blah. But that's not always the key to knowing if someone's an authority on something. What's an example of a resource that would be, a very good authority on a subject by someone that's not a scholar of that subject? What would be a good kind of resource, an authority on a subject who's not a scholar of that subject? Can I think of something like that?
An experience.
An experience, yeah, someone writing a narrative about something that happened to them. What else? What are other sorts of things that would be helpful? An authoritative resource, not by a scholar.
Primary source.
A primary source, yeah, something that's an interview, something that's not necessarily digested, and yet it's actually so important and so authoritative. So kind of like what gives them the right.
If I wanted to learn about music or Dungeons and Dragons, I would ask my students first.
Exactly. And again, the reason that we pose these as questions is because, you can say, these are the rules of citing sources. Don't go to .com, only read things by X, Y, and Z. And when they exist as rules, they don't work for every source, because rules don't work on everything. But when they're questions, we kind of train a process of inquiry that students can use that's flexible enough to be used on a scholarly object or a non-scholarly object. Third one is relevance. This one is incredibly important to high schoolers. The relevance question, does this resource help me answer my question? Oh my God. It's so often that someone says, I have a question about birds, and you go and you find a resource about birds, and at the bottom it talks about elephants, and then you read an article about elephants, and you find out this really cool thing about the geology of Africa. And then you read this article about Ethiopia, and you're so excited about this cool magical realist author that you just discovered, and you end up totally far away from your original question, which is about birds. And so this question of relevance is such an important thing to train, because when we're asking a question, the question should change a little bit as we research it, but we really want to try, if it's a good question, we should try to answer it in that original form we wrote it in. So does this help me? And kind of combined with this is we're trying to give them a sense of discernment, right? Is this super, super interesting, but actually not relevant? That's a really good thing to know about a source. The fourth is currency. Not money. How current is this resource? Is it from this year? Is it from last year? I had this hilarious moment the other day when a student found a source from 2006, and I was like, oh, it's not that old. And she was like, Sage, that's the year I was born. And it was like one of the first times in my life that I felt incredibly old. How current is a resource? Is it dated? You know, this question really matters because things that are new are not always right. You know, sometimes you're dealing with a question where you're going to want a resource that's 2,000 years old. A lot of the questions that we ask in you know, the history curriculum, we're looking to resources that are 2,000 years old. We're looking to resources that are 100 years old to 50 years old. You know, we're doing a speculative fiction block right now, and I'm asking students to look at all these different pieces of art by people over time that have speculated on what the future will look like and what the future will be. And sometimes, you know, a painter from France from the 19th century can be a really current source to a question that you have today, depending on what that painter said and what your question is. When. And the final piece of this tool is accuracy. ACY. Is this information reliable? So this is kind of the more classic high school, you know, is it supported by evidence? You know, is it something that, you know, do they cite their sources? Kind of learn those more classic techniques of like a reliable source and accurate information. One important thing though, is accuracy, again, doesn't necessarily have to do with formality. Like you can have a really accurate source that's casually made. Someone could have a blog where they're writing their personal experience, where they have lots of images. Someone's analyzing a piece of art and they zoom in on all these different parts of it. And they say, look, here's some evidence for this and here's some evidence for that. That can really contribute to accuracy of something. You don't necessarily have to get caught up in something like degrees or bios of the writer. So accuracy is really this question of evidence. So this is a tool, this is a set of questions that I taught the students that we're going to kind of, again, you ask them about them, they might not remember because sometimes they forget things. But we're kind of going to circle back over it again and again over the 4 years of high school to ingrain these questions into their process of inquiry so that they're really prepared in college or in the world to be able to verify what someone is saying, why they're saying it, and whether it's useful to them. Right. So that's this little piece. And timing-wise, what are we at with
I
time?
think we're ready.
I think we're ready to
We
move.
need to wrap up and move
wrap up.
upstairs back to the great hall.
Okay, cool. All right, well, that is that. Thank you, everybody. Move back up to the